Hello, writers. Welcome to session 5, Weaving Narration Through Stories. So, when I was little, when I watched the movie Pinocchio, there was a little cricket guy named Jiminy Cricket who came on screen wearing a top hat and coat and carrying a cane at various times in the story. And he would talk right to those of us watching the movie. He'd say things like, "One night, a long time ago, my travels took me to," or he'd say, "Of course, I'm just a cricket singing my way from hearth to hearth, but let me tell you what made me change my mind." And maybe you've watched some shows where that happens too, sometimes where a character talks right to the audience. Now, as a grown up, I know that the fancy word for that little cricket guy is narrator. You all know about narrators. Because when you and your partner, during reading time, decide to take parts and read aloud in the role of characters, and there are some words that none of the obvious characters say, that's usually the narrator's part. I'm telling you this because if you read a ton of fairy tales, you quickly realize that many of them have a Jiminy Cricket character in them, a narrator who comes out on stage and makes a little speech to readers. Listen to the start of these stories, and you'll hear the narrator, and then you'll hear when the actual story gets started. So let's listen to this part of Prince Cinders by Babette Cole. Prince Cinders was not much of a prince. He was small, spotty, scruffy, and skinny. He had 3 big hairy brothers who were always teasing him about his looks. So that's the narrator speaking. Then the narrator stops saying his lines, and the small moment story takes over. One Saturday night, when he was washing the socks, a dirty fairy fell down the chimney. Here's another from Cinderella. Once upon a time, or so they tell me, there was a girl called Cinderella. Ellie was good, and she was pretty. She lived with her folks in New York City. And then the narrator's part ends and the story starts. But then one day, Elle got a note. So did her sisters. Somebody wrote. So again, notice in all of those, there was kind of that shift from someone talking about the story, and then we start with that one day, one time, one night. So today I want to teach you that when writers of fairy tales use narration or telling in some important ways, they use it to introduce the story, to stitch one scene to the next, and to end the story. So, the first place that writers of fairy tales use the power of telling is at the beginning of the story. Fairy tale writers often start by almost coming out on stage, talking to readers, filling them in on the background to the story. For example, the classic Cinderella tale does not begin in the ways you've learned to begin a story, with a small moment and a character who is saying or doing something. Cinderella, if we were thinking about it as a play, isn't even out on stage at the start of the classic version. Instead, it is as if a narrator comes out on stage and gives the readers a little speech, explaining some of the background to the story. The narrator tells the readers, "There once was a man whose wife died, and so he took another. The new wife was proud and haughty and had 2 daughters who were just like her in every way. But the man also had a daughter, and she was sweet and gentle and good as gold." Did you hear how the narrator pops in like Jiminy Cricket and gets the story going? And that's not the only place that writers use narration. The narrator is also used to stitch the scenes, the small moments of a story together. Usually there is a jump in time and place between one small moment story and another, and the narrator of the story, the Jiminy Cricket, comes out on stage and talks directly to readers, saying, "After this, a bunch of time went by. Then one day, in this other place." And then the readers are back into a second small moment story. In fairy tales, the narrator often uses fancier words to stitch scenes together. They might say, "After some months have passed, the king's son gave a ball for all the stylish people in the countryside." And "For 2 days, the sisters could hardly eat for excitement." And "At last, the evening of the ball came." But the important thing for you to know is that another powerful way to use narration is to stitch together small moment stories so the readers understand how they fit together. So here's two important things in a small chart for you. The power of narration. It provides a backstory at the beginning of the story and stitches together some small moment scenes. So writers, I'm going to ask you to go ahead. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to stop and jot some narration we could use for the beginning of our class story on Cinderella. Off you go. So while you were stopping and jotting, I did the same thing as well. And this is what I came up with for our opening narration. Once long ago, in a land far away, there lived a girl named Cinderella. Cinderella tried to be cheerful, but it was kind of hard. She lived with her evil stepmother and two mean stepsisters. They made Cinderella work all the time. All she wanted to do was read. So see, Cinderella's not jumping in and starting the scene. The narrator is just setting everything up for us. Then I was thinking I could also use some between my scenes. And I would probably start it with something like later that night, because we knew that we were having some time change between our other scenes. So did you notice how in just a couple of sentences, we use the power of narration to give readers a backstory at the beginning? And we could just simply use the words later that night too from our narrator to stitch together our two scenes, because we know we had one where she was getting the letter and then later that night, she's off crying in her room. But if we don't have some of that narration, it's very hard for our readers to understand what is happening. So let's review our chart on how to write a fairy tale adaptation. We know that we need to know the classic story and tell it often. Decide on a change to improve the story, and then our domino effect, make the change lead to other changes. We want to make sure we have those characters that have strong traits and wants, and they run into some trouble. We want to practice telling our story in just 2 or 3 scenes, those little small moments. And if you remember, we were really working on storytelling or acting out a scene before we write it. We need to have an ending that solves a problem. And then here's our new part for today. We need to give a backstory at the start and then stitch the scenes together. So now it's time to get writing. For the first part of workshop now, for the next 10 minutes or so, I want you to focus just on your narration. Set up your fairy tale. So get that beginning narration, get your backstory in, and work on places you could add narration to stitch together your scenes. Off you go, writers. interrupt you for a minute. So you've spent the first part of Writer's Workshop working on your narration, fitting it in between your scenes. You could have even cut and pasted some strips of paper around and setting up that backstory. But one of the things we haven't actually written out yet is that last scene, the ending in our story. Remember that you had time to practice this during our share in session 4. So now, if your narration is all set for your backstory and your linking, I want you to take the next part of Writer's Workshop to think about how you would act out your final scene and really stretch it out. Get to planning your final scene. You'll see that you have pages for that underneath session 5. And again, make sure you're staying within that scene. You're not speeding up and moving on. All right, off you go, writers. Writers, for Share today, I want to talk to you about another way that writers use narration. Sometimes it may be used at the end of a story to wrap up loose ends and sort of send the reader on his or her way. So listen to the ending of the classic Cinderella, and you'll see what I mean. Cinderella was taken before the prince. He was overwhelmed with love for her, and sometime later they were married. Cinderella, who was as good as she was beautiful, gave her two sisters a home in the palace, and that very same day they were married to two lords of the court. It's kind of like Jiminy Cricket coming back on stage one last time to tell us a few things we need to know about how everything fits together in the end. So I want you to take some time now to go ahead, look at the endings you were just working on, and see if you can add in some ending narration. We can add this third kind of narration power to our chart too. The power of narration provides a backstory at the beginning of the story. It stitches together small moments, and now we know it can also be used to wrap the story up at the end. So in your session 5 pages, you'll see you have a spot for ending narration. Let's take about 5 minutes to go work on some of these, and then we'll share some out. Good job today, writers.